Okay, guys, so we are going to make a stop in with our 19th president, Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes, whose life spanned from 1822 to 1893, the 19th president of the United States, won a controversial and fiercely disputed election against Samuel Tilden. He withdrew troops from the Reconstruction states in order to restore local control and goodwill, a decision that many perceived as a betrayal of African Americans in the South. He served a single term, as he had promised in his inaugural address. Rutherford Bertrand Hayes was born in Delaware, Ohio, on October 4th, 1822, to Sophia Bertrand Hayes, whose life spanned from 1792 to 1866. His father, Rutherford Hayes Jr., whose life spanned from 1787 to 1822, was a farmer who had died shortly before his son's birth. The young Hayes, known as Rudd, and his sister Fanny, whose life spanned from 1820 to 1856, were raised in Lower Sandusky, later called Fremont, Ohio, by the mother and uncle Sardis Burchard. Whose life spanned from 1801 to 1874, a successful businessman. Did you know in 1879, President Rutherford Hayes signed the act to relieve certain legal disabilities of women, which cleared the way for female attorneys to argue cases in any U.S. federal court. In 1880, Bolivia Lockwood, whose life spanned from 1830 to 1917, became the first female lawyer to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. Hayes was educated at schools in Delaware and Norwalk, Ohio, and Middletown, Connecticut. In 1842, he graduated at the top of his class from Kenyon College in Gerber, Ohio. 3 years later, in 1845, he earned a law degree from Harvard University. Upon his graduation from Harvard, Hayes was admitted to the Ohio bar and began practicing law in Lower Sandusky. Hearing that there were greater opportunities in Kentucky, Hayes moved there in 1849 and eventually developed a successful law practice. An opponent of slavery, he also became active in the newly formed Republican Party, which was organized by the 1850s to oppose the expansion of slavery to U.S. territories. In 1852, Hayes married Lucy Ware Webb, whose life spanned from 1831 to 1889. A graduate of Kentucky West Women's College, she would be the first presidential wife to graduate from college. The couple went on to have 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. In 1858, The Cincinnati City Council appointed the up-and-coming Rutherford Hayes to fill the position of city solicitor. The following year, he was re-elected to the post, which helped boost his public profile across Ohio. Now, I'm not sure if I'm actually saying that city correct. If I'm not, I'm completely sorry. I'm not from Ohio. Shortly after the outbreak of American Civil War in 1861, Hayes signed up to fight for the Union. He became a major in the 23rd Ohio Regiment and was seriously wounded during the Battle of South Mountain in Maryland. By the end of the war, Hayes had been promoted to the rank of Brevet Major General. In 1864, when Hayes was still on the battlefield defending the North, the Republican Party in Cincinnati nominated him for Congress. He accepted the nomination but refused to campaign. In a letter to his friend, Ohio Secretary of State William Henry Smith, whose life spanned from 1833 to 1896, Hayes explained, "An officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped." Hayes left the Army after the war ended in 1865, and in December of that year, having won the election, took his seat in the House of Representatives. Hayes was re-elected to his congressional seat in 1866, but resigned in 1867 to run for governor of Ohio. He won the race and was re-elected in 1869. At the conclusion of his second term as governor in 1872, he wanted to retire from politics altogether. But the Ohio Republican Party had other plans. The party nominated Hayes to run for Congress in 1872, a race in which he lost. At that point, Hayes and his growing family moved from Cincinnati back to Fremont, where he had begun his law career. Hayes practiced law for 3 years before again receiving his party's nomination for governor. Hayes was elected governor for the third time in 1875 on a platform focused on the procurement of voting rights for blacks and on economic plans calling for a strong gold-backed currency. At the Republican National Nominating Convention in 1876, the party was split between one faction who supported a third term of President Ulysses S. Grant and another faction who supported the nomination of Speaker of House James G. Blaine, whose life spanned from 1830 to 1893, of Maine. As a compromise candidate, Hayes earned the party's nomination on the 7th ballot. His reputation for being honest, loyal, and inclusive offered a departure from the change of impropriety in Grant's administration. In the 1876 presidential election between Hayes and the Democratic Samuel J. Tilden, the governor from New York, Tilden won the popular vote by approximately 250,000 votes. However, the Democratic and Republican parties in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina each sent their own conflicting ballot results to Washington. Because there was 2 sets of results from each state, with each party's tally declaring its own candidate to be victor, Congress appointed a 15-member commission to determine winner of each state's electoral vote. The commission, which had a Republican majority, chose to award the disputed electoral votes to Hayes. Southern Democrats agreed to back the decision of if the Republicans would recall the federal troops that were supporting Reconstruction. At the urge of the Southern Democrats, the Republican also agreed to appoint at least one Southerner to Hayes' cabinet. When the commission voted to award the contested electoral votes to Hayes, he tallied 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184 votes. Hayes was declared winner on March 2nd, 1877. He took the presidential oath of office in a private ceremony at the White House the next day. A public inauguration followed on March 5th. Northern Democrats who were unhappy with the outcome declared that Hayes had stolen the election. As president, Hayes ended Reconstruction within his first year in office by withdrawing federal troops from states still under occupations. He made federal dollars available for infrastructure improvement in the South and appointed Southerners to influential high-level government positions. While these actions satisfied Southern Democrats, they also antagonized some members of Hayes' own party. The Republicans who had opposed Hayes' candidacy at the party convention were even more frustrated by the president's plan for civil service reform, which focused on ending patronage in favor of appointing civil servants based on merit. Hayes wrangled with U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, who contested Hayes' call for reconstruction of 2 top bureaucrats in the New York Custom House, including the future 21st president, Chester Arthur, who will get into future videos, who was the then collector of Port of New York. Hayes called for Arthur's resignation in a symbolic attempt to undo Conkling's political patronage. In addition to party policies, Hayes experienced policy difficulties that arose outside Washington. Because of the economic downturn following the Civil War, Western and Southern states sought to strengthen the dollar. They wanted to do this through the Bland-Allison Act of 1878, sponsored by the Representative Richard P. Bland of Missouri and Representative William B. Allison of Iowa. The act allowed the federal government to resume minting silver coins, which had been halted 5 years earlier. With inflation a primary concern, Hayes and others who supported a gold standard for the nation's currency stood against the measure. However, Bland-Allison passed over Hayes' veto. Hayes declared to run for presidency a second time and Hayes declined to run for presidency a second time and retired from politics after his term in the Oval Office ended in 1881. He was succeeded by James Garfield, who was assassinated just 6 months into his term. After leaving the White House, Hayes and his wife Lucy returned to their estate, Spangle Grove, in Fremont, Ohio, and the former president devoted himself to educational issues and prison reform, among other humanitarian causes. In addition to serving as trustee of 3 universities, Ohio Wesleyan, Western Reserve, and Ohio State, Hayes also became the first president of the board of John F. Slater Education Fund for Freedom in 1882. The Slater Fund was a $1 million endowment to provide Christian education for Southern blacks. Among the fund's notable recipients was the socialist and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, whose life spanned from 1868 to 1963. In 1883, Hayes became the first president of the newly recognized National Prison Reform Association. For nearly 10 years, he traveled around the country speaking on policy reform topics. In January of 1893, while on business in Cleveland, Hayes fell ill. The ex-president sent for his son, Webb C. Hayes, to escort him back home to Fremont, where he died of heart failure at the age of 70 on January 17th, 3.5 years after the death of his wife. After Hayes's death, Webb established a presidential library in his father's name in Spangle Grove, setting the precedent for construction and dedication of post-term presidential libraries. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one.